Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our march of the penguins through my Penguin Classic wall there in the background, going author by author and book by book and period by period. And recently we are in the Middle Ages. My collection of Penguin Classics for what is routinely known as the Middle Ages can't be called anything like complete. There are lots of volumes that I don't have, but some of the ones that I do have, I've gone back to over and over again, and this is one of them. The one we're doing with today is we're dealing with an author, so I'll show you a couple of books. I believe these are pretty much the only things that Penguin Classic ever did by this author, but this author wrote indefatigably throughout his whole lifetime, so there's an enormous amount of it. And once again, we're dealing with a churchman, a 12th century churchman named Gerald of Wales, Geraldus Cambrensis, who I have taken a great deal of ribbing for this author in my recent years. I find him fascinating. I find his story and his writing fascinating. Penguin does this book, The Journey Through Wales and a Description of Wales, and they also do the history and topography of Ireland. I believe they don't do anything else. Gerald of Wales would have been, I think, a little bit amazed if he'd come forward in time 1,000 years and seen that these were the ones that had any kind of popular circulation of all the things he wrote. I'm pretty sure he would have wanted his scriptural and liturgical writing to be remembered, but it isn't. I have read pretty much everything this author has written, and once upon a time that was true of every bookish person in the Western world. It's hard to believe, except on this March of the Penguins, that the wheel of fate has turned so thoroughly on this author. He's not known at all anymore. He was once famous, and we've seen that many times. Gerald doesn't so much evoke the problems that we've had, the questions that we've had with translations. He is not a complex writer at all, to put it mildly. And his manuscripts are neither here nor there. They survive well enough. So we don't have to worry about the pitiless ratio or the questions of translation. Instead, we have to worry about a bigger problem, something that has come up a couple of times, and that comes up elsewhere on BookTube. It comes up all the time in our bookish discussions, which is the necessity to separate the person from the work. And that problem gets more and more toothless the further in time you go. Right? I mean, it's AD 2020 right now. In AD 2120, there won't be anything like the kind of visceral gut tensing that happens when, for instance, I want Penguin Classic to print Mein Kampf. Adolf Hitler's horrible, scurrilous, vicious book that it was nevertheless read by millions of people, and that history turned on the stuff that was in those pages, and that is the classic demonstration of separating the author from the work. There was, I'm going to get the date wrong here, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, there was a great popular scholarly edition of Mein Kampf in Germany. Tons and tons of footnotes, a great introduction, wasn't an excuse, wasn't a defense at all, laid out in clear terms that this is a loathsome work by one of the most loathsome people to ever live. But nevertheless, it did really well because it wasn't just one of these free copies of Mein Kampf that you get that you can download for free or get cheap at Bookfinder or Book Depository or whatnot. It was a scholarly work, and I understand Penguin Classic will never do it, but in 2120 they will. I would believe that they will, that they won't even hesitate to do it. And I don't mean to draw a one-to-one comparison here, but Gerald of Wales he comes across as amiable in his books. Very much. He strikes that tone, except when he's angry with someone. He blackened reputations in his books as often as he wanted to, but in for instance, the two books that Penguin Classic does, he comes across very amiable, where he's just relating wonders and signs and portents and describing odd things that he's seen. We'll get into a couple of descriptions. But he wasn't amiable. He wasn't. He was a Norman who liked to play up the tiny trickle of Welsh blood that he had in his veins, and he was born in 1150, something like that, somewhere around there, and came to social and ecclesiastical prominence at the height of Plantagenet power. He attached himself to the court and to the person of King Henry II, and also to Henry's sons. Now that is no mean feat. There are only a handful of courtiers of any kind, whether they were military or ecclesiastical or whatever, who could do that from one to the other, from Richard to from Henry to young Henry to Richard to John. They were radically different personalities. For you to be able to surf successfully between all of them and stay alive was no mean feat. But Gerald of Wales did that. He managed that feat, not in the way that, for instance, William Marshall did. He did it by constantly sinking to the lowest common denominator, whatever he needed to be, whatever the Plantagenets needed him to be, he would be. And his family, he and his family were instrumental in invading Ireland and crushing or trying to crush the local population. Now, a long time has passed, 1,000 years has gone by, but nevertheless, those people still suffered. Those babies were still spiked on pikes. Those old widows were still roasted over open fires for the pleasure of King John's soldiers. And Gerald of Wales knew all about that. He helped to be an architect of that invasion, of those horrors. So the more you know about him, the little that we know about him, the more you know about him, I think, the more you dislike him. But that just brings forward the question that I mentioned, which we have to separate that. We have to look at his books. And these two books, I don't think they're the most interesting things that he did. I would say his religious writings are 10 times more interesting, but I can understand Penguin's point of view in doing these because the religious writings rely on you knowing a lot. They'd have to be heavily footnoted. It would be a significant scholarly undertaking. I'd love to see it, but I'm being bumped into from behind here. Frida is making her bed behind me, and when she does this, she pulls at pillows and blankets, but she also just thinks that I'm part of the furniture and shoves me one way or another. I always have to remind her that she's 10 pounds. She weighs 10 pounds. She has nothing to bargain with here. You're knocking me all around. Let's see your fans. Oh, you boo. Oh, hello, baby. Oh. But nevertheless, even though I think those religious writings are more interesting, these are the ones we get for Penguin Classic. I don't have any other Gerald of Wales here. And I've written about these books. If I can, once again, if I remember, I will find the works that I have done. I'm trying to do that for all of these Penguin Classics because I've written about a great many of them. But unfortunately, I wrote about them for Open Letters Monthly, an online literary journal where I wrote quite a bit for 10 years. And then when that periodical transmogrified, it transformed into Open Letters Review, we did a bulk port of all of that stuff from one site to the other. And as any of you have ever tried anything like that, it's a nightmare. It compresses things, it mushes things up, it loses all sorts of links, and you can sometimes lose prose. So it takes a while to hunt around for these things. I will, if I can, I will look around for all that. She's just going nuts behind me. What are you doing, baby? Huh? What are you doing? I will find those links and leave them to you, but I wanted to give you a little taste of what these are like. The Journey Through Wales and Description of Wales is by Lewis Thorpe, translation, which we... I want to show it to you, but I'm afraid you'll be frightened. She's acting like some sort of mythological monster here. What is the matter with you? Huh? What's the matter with you? Here. Oh, here you see your fans again. Oh, why are you being so antsy? Huh? You don't like Gerald of Wales either? Is that it? Oh. She always tries to look so innocent. She's not innocent. And then the history and topography of Ireland is more topography than history. Gerald of Wales didn't know much about the history of the Ireland of his day. But we have his... this translation is by John O'Meara, and he gives us everything, including little period illustrations that are all throughout here. And also, I don't know if you can make that out, Gerald's own marginalia is recorded. It's typed into this as much as it can be and translated. But I want to read you just a bit of this, not only to show you what you would expect if you got this book, but also to show you the chain that connects some of our Penguin classics. We see this creature. That is a beaver. Let's see here. Beavers use a similar contrivance of nature. When they are building their homes in the rivers, they use slaves of their own kind as carts, and so by this wonderful means of transport pull and drag lengths of wood from the forest to the waters. In both kinds of animal, beaver and badger, the slaves are distinguished by a certain inferiority of shape and a worn, bare patch upon their backs. He doesn't have any idea what he's talking about. He wants to enslave the Irish people and wants to draw an odious echo in nature. Beavers, of course, don't employ slaves. But that's all right. Ireland has badgers, but not beavers. In Wales, beavers are to be found only in the Teffy River near Cardigan. They are, in the same way, scarce in Scotland. One should remark that beavers have wide tails, spread out like the palm of a human hand, and not long. They use them as oars in swimming, and while the whole of the rest of their body is very furry, they are entirely free from fur on this part, and are quite bare and slippery like a seal. Consequently, in Germany and the northern regions, where beavers are plentiful, great and holy men eat the tails of beavers during fasting times, as being fish, since, as they say, they partake of the nature of the fish, both in taste and color. How's that for getting around the Lenten prescriptions? He'll eat a tail of a beaver, because it's close enough to a fish. But about these and their nature, how and with what skill they build their settlements in the middle of rivers, and how, when pressed by an enemy, by the loss of a part they save the whole, a contrivance most commendable in an animal. I think what Gerald is getting at there is that he thinks that if you pull on a beaver's tail, it will detach, like the tail of a lizard. Will be more fully explained when we come to deal with the geography and description of Wales and Scotland, and the origin and nature of the people of each. We shall find another opportunity for doing this, and to another purpose, with God's help, and if life be spared. The island suffers the absence of certain wild beasts. Wild goats, deer generally, hedgehogs, and polecats are wanting. Moles are either not here at all, or at any rate are very scarce on account of the great humidity of the country. Mice are infinite in number and consume much more grain than anywhere else, as well as eating garments, even though they be locked up carefully. Bede says that they are only two kinds of harmful beasts in Ireland, namely wolves and foxes. I would add the mouse as a third and say it is very harmful indeed. There we have Gerald of Wales just offhandedly mentioning Bede, another best-selling author, an earlier best-selling author who his readers would have known. He wouldn't have needed to explain that name. And I think that's fascinating because we're seeing these people. These were the literary lights of their day. And these are the Gerald of Wales. Mine are a little battered because I keep going back to this author. That's our Penguin Classics for today, is Gerald of Wales. But I couldn't let, just like with Beowulf, I couldn't let a mention of Gerald of Wales go without mentioning an entirely different kind of book. Not a Penguin Classic, nor I would imagine ever going to be a Penguin Classic, but a terrific book, and something that you should really find if you can. I've mentioned it on this channel before. This is James Goldman, Myself as Witness. And this is a novel by an author who is best known as a playwright, as the author of the play The Lion in Winter, which is about Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and in which we see Richard as a 30-something man and King John as an awkward teenager. In Myself as Witness, this is just a full-blown historical novel. It's not a play, and it stars an adult King John and his wife and all of his court functionaries and all of the troubles that his reign had. You think of Magna Carta, but also wars that he couldn't finance and couldn't win, disasters of one kind or another, horrible international relations, and easy to lay a lot of it at the feet of John himself. And the reason that I mention this book is because it's narrated by Gerald of Wales. James Goldman decides to first of all, he decides to make Gerald of Wales a partisan Welshman, and then to have him be, what better way to narrate a historical novel than by a historian. So he narrates this in the first person, and it's an extremely good novel, extremely good. On a list of historical novels set in earlier eras of British or English history, this would be on my list of the top 10, definitely. This and Richard Kluger's book, The Sheriff of Nottingham, which also is about King John. But I strongly recommend it. I don't think Myself as Witness is in print anymore, but I don't know what its last edition looked like. But if you're interested in this period, and if you're interested in Gerald of Wales, a kind of Gerald of Wales, a fictionalized, semi-heroic Gerald of Wales, then this is a book you'll really like. And I couldn't let it go. Since we're talking about Gerald of Wales, I couldn't let it go because he's a star in this book, and I don't think he's going to be a star in any other book ever. So that is it. That is Gerald of Wales for your Daily Penguin. And we are still lodged in the long Middle Ages. So I would imagine we'll get a few of those done this week. We'll just continue. So I will fire up the old Penguin machine tomorrow, and we will talk about what's next. Thank you, BookTube.